Everything football gave him, football took away. Because he died never even knowing or remembering he'd ever been a footballer.
Watching anybody with dementia is a painful process. And our family, like other families, are going through that.
It's not just we need to know and we need closure, but all these other families need to know. But more importantly, perhaps football needs to know.
For the family of former England and West Brom player Jeff Astle, today's research is no surprise. Back in 2002, a coroner ruled that years of heading heavy leather footballs caused his dementia. A brain scan revealed CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The verdict on his death certificate reads industrial disease.
The Scottish Football Association is expected to introduce a ban on under-12s heading the ball during training over fears there's a link between the sport and dementia later in life.
For years, there have been tentative links made between heading and neurodegenerative diseases. Following the release of a recent report that suggests those links are increasingly credible, the Scottish FA have decided to take a stance on the issue. In this episode, we look at the SFA's proposed ban on heading in youth football and ask, is this the best approach to preventing head injuries in football?
This has been kind of rumbling on here for a while now.
Chris McLaughlin is a sports correspondent at BBC Scotland.
I should probably nod towards the Sunday Mail newspaper, who a few months ago said that the SFA were discussing this. My story recently just confirmed that this was actually going ahead and it had more of a time frame on it. So it's not a huge surprise, I don't think, given the reaction to the report that I'm sure we'll come on to talk about with regards to the links between football and dementia. Basically, the Scottish FA have been discussing what to do since that report. They've spoken to a number of stakeholders, a number of people within the game, a number of medical experts, and they feel that the best option at the moment is to, until more research is done, just to implement a blanket ban on children the age of 12 and under during training sessions. This, of course, is not relating to match action, to games themselves, just training.
Is there a timeline for the implementation of this ban?
It looks like they want this up and running before the new grassroots season kicks off, and that's just in a few weeks' time. So I would expect the guidelines to be implemented by then. Now, the Scottish FA, when I ran this story a few days ago, said that there was nothing concrete yet, there was nothing official yet, that the guidelines were still being discussed, and that they would talk about the guidelines when it was officially due to be implemented. But my understanding is that the ban will make up those guidelines, or certainly part of those guidelines. And I expect, as I said, for that to happen in the next couple of weeks.
You've mentioned that as of now, the ban will simply be in training scenarios. There won't be any banning of heading during games.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that basically is that, having spoken to a number of coaches, youth coaches and senior coaches, they tell me that there's not really a lot of heading of the ball by kids anyway. So it makes more sense to keep it strictly to training, because we do see kids taking part in heading drills during training. So they've looked at this, they've looked at the best possible way of creating some kind of impact in terms of mitigation with regards to dementia. Now, remember, there is no firm evidence yet to suggest that heading the ball is linked to dementia, but what they're saying is, look, until there is more research done on this, then let's at least take it out of training sessions, because obviously, as I said, they have training drills, but they don't necessarily head the ball at that age in matches themselves very often.
As you've mentioned, the impetus for this ruling goes back to a report that was released in October last year, which appeared in the New England Journal of Medicine. It was entitled Neurodegenerative Disease Mortality Among Former Professional Soccer Players, and concluded,
"In this retrospective epidemiological analysis, mortality from neurodegenerative disease was higher, and mortality from other common diseases lower among former Scottish professional soccer players than among matched controls. Dementia-related medications were prescribed more frequently to former players than to controls."
Can you break down what this actually means for football?
Essentially, what this means is this is the very first piece of scientific evidence to link dementia and football. We have all heard various anecdotes and various suggestions down the years that, given the fact that we have witnessed former football players, some very big names, dying of neurodegenerative diseases, dementia being the key to that, there have been many suggestions and anecdotal evidence of a link. But this is the very first time that we have seen scientific evidence to suggest a link between dementia and football. Now, what the report said was that essentially, if you're a former football player, you're essentially 3.5 times more likely to die of a neurodegenerative disease than someone who makes up just the majority of your normal population, if you like. So, as you can imagine, that raised some eyebrows. No suggestion yet as to why. Now, it could simply be that footballers lead a certain lifestyle and that leads to it. It could be other factors. It could be social factors. Now, there is ongoing research at the moment to try and dig a little deeper, because what this says is, look, there is a link. Why the link is there, we don't know. We're going to have to dig a little deeper into this to find out exactly what's going on here.
So, in summary, it suggests that if you are a Scottish footballer and have now retired, you are 3.5 times more likely to suffer from a neurodegenerative disease than if you were in any other profession.
That's right, and I've spoken to a number of former football players who seem genuinely concerned by that, and you can imagine why. 3.5 times more likely is pretty big. What they want to see now is firm evidence as to why that is the case. And of course, football now has to properly look at this, because it was easy enough for football to brush this off when this was just a suggestion. This was people just looking at this and thinking maybe something's going on here. Now we have the scientific evidence to confirm that something is indeed going on, and the football players, not just former football players, but people, parents of children coming into the game, current football players, clearly for obvious reasons want to know why. And that, I suppose, is the next stage of the research.
So how did the SFA respond to this study?
Well, the SFA have been very closely linked to this study because their Dr. John McLean was part of the study itself, led by Dr. Willie Stewart at Glasgow University.
Are we jumping the gun a little bit with this?
No, there's been a lot of research in the last decade or so suggesting that head injury and head impact across all sports are a risk for the brain. So I don't think we're jumping the gun. I think it's about time.
Bizarrely, this was actually a study that was partly funded by the English FA, by the Football Association, who have kind of distanced themselves a little bit from it in recent weeks. But the SFA, because it was Scottish research conducted by a Scottish university with Scottish experts, have really embraced this, and I think that's why we're seeing them looking to lead the way in Europe, given the fact that a ban like this is already in place in the US. So the Scottish FA, when the study itself was released, said that we will go away, we will look at this, and we will act on this, and this is now what we're seeing.
These sorts of findings have been well documented in North America, but so far European countries have been behind the curve a little bit. Why do you think the SFA have responded so proactively to these findings?
I think partly because, as I said, this was Scottish research carried out in Scotland by Scottish experts, and I think that the Scottish FA really wanted to try and own this. They really wanted to try and lead the way on this, because it would have seemed a little bizarre if this research that had been carried out on Scottish football players in Scotland was not then responded to in the proper manner. So I think the Scottish FA have realised that they had an opportunity here to, as I say, lead the way in European football with regards to dementia and football. And they have clearly been working closely with Dr. Willie Stewart and his team anyway. So they wanted to make sure that they were seen as progressive And as I say, they were seen to be leading the way. I think a lot of eyebrows have been raised in national associations across European football and beyond since the story about the heading ban broke last week. So it's going to be very interesting to see how other national associations respond to this. But certainly the SFA want to look progressive and they want to lead the way on this.
What about the clubs, coaches, players within Scottish football? How have they responded to the news that something like this will be rolled out?
Mixed, I would say, but I think mostly positive. I think any former players that I've spoken to and any current players that I've spoken to would suggest that, look, this just makes sense. Why not take this approach? Football managers of several clubs in Scotland have spoken in support of this, although Stephen Gerrard at Rangers said that he thought it was perhaps going too far until more research had been done. He perhaps echoing what the FA have said, which is that they don't think there's any evidence yet to suggest that there's a need to ban heading in youth football. But I think broadly, football are just thinking this is a fairly sensible, pragmatic approach. So we're not saying here that this is the beginning of the end of headers in football. What the SFA are saying is until more research is done, then there's no reason why we shouldn't, given the fact that it doesn't really happen very often in youth football anyway. They're simply saying, look, why take the chance? And I think, broadly speaking, football in Scotland, footballers, coaches, former players have been broadly supportive of it.
Although Scotland is ahead of the curve within the European context, the United States Soccer Federation has had a ban on heading in youth soccer since 2016. John Curtis is a former player, a USSF A licensed coach, and the founder of the National Centre of Excellence programme.
Everybody knows how litigious the US society is, and there was a couple of incidents out on the West Coast, I believe, where children had taken multiple concussions from playing the game. I think it was more collisions, head-to-head, knee-to-head, etc. There'd been a couple of court cases, and the US soccer had been embroiled in this court case in some capacity.
The most popular sport in the world. More American kids play soccer than tackle football or baseball, long encouraged by parents as the safe alternative to its violent U.S. cousin. But this morning, it's linked to CTE, the very same repetitive head trauma disease seen in some pro football players. New evidence that one of soccer's most exciting plays can cause brain damage.
The outcome of it is that the US soccer wanted to protect themselves, and obviously they want to protect the welfare of children playing the game. A lot of research came out, a lot of stuff a few years ago. Remember the Will Smith movie and things like that.
I found a disease that no one has ever seen. Repetitive head trauma chokes the brain.
The NFL does not want to talk to you. You turned on the lights and gave their biggest boogeyman a name.
There was a lot of head injuries and awareness of head injuries in American football as well. So it was kind of the natural progression down into soccer, as they call it. US soccer did some research and proposed to change the rules in youth soccer to protect young athletes from either repetitive head injuries or concussions through knocks, head-to-head, knee-to-head, etc. that occur in youth soccer games.
So there's been some lawsuits that state that the governing bodies have been negligent and they've sought an injunction on impact collisions. So what did the USSF do about this?
Well, they introduced a rule that restricted the ability of players to practice heading the ball, and they banned it in the very youngest age group. So the 9-10s age group, they completely banned it. I think anybody under 11 is completely banned. And I think at 12 to 13, there's kind of limits in place of how many heading practices the kids can do. So they really clamped down on it. And there were some other changes that US soccer introduced at around the same time as well, with game formats, changing the recommended field dimensions, goal dimensions, and number of players on the field and things like that. So it was a lot of sweeping changes that came very quickly in the US a few years back and are now commonplace. You know, it's been adopted and everybody is comfortable with this.
So you've mentioned that there's been some rule changes implemented by the USSF. Do you know what the rule actually looks like about heading in under-10s soccer?
Well, in under-10 soccer, it is banned. So players are not able to head the ball, which when it was first introduced, it was, and still now, to be honest, some of the situations that occur are very farcical. So you have a lot of very uneducated coaches over here in the US, and there is a win at all costs kind of mentality, even at the very youngest age groups. So you'll have coaches encouraging their kids to launch the ball into the penalty area at all times, knowing that the opposition cannot defend the ball properly by heading it clear. What you end up getting is loads of kids raising their feet to try and overhead kick it and deal with it with their feet, or they try and shoulder the ball. There are all kinds of kind of incidents that occur as a result of that. So lessons for the SFA would be to think about the rule in a broader context, I think, because it will affect the game and how the game is played in Scotland.
So presumably the kids still head the ball occasionally. What happens if that is the case?
Yeah, it's a free kick. It's an indirect free kick if the player heads the ball.
When a player deliberately heads a ball in a game, an indirect free kick should be awarded to the opposing team from the spot of the offence. If the deliberate header occurs within the goal area, the indirect free kick should be taken on the goal area line parallel to the goal line at the point nearest to where the infringement occurred.
But it's not that has changed the game per se. It is coaches trying to take advantage of the rule. It makes defending in and around the penalty area very, very difficult for the young kids. You know, a better rule might have been to say the ball can't go above waist height or something like that. That may have been an easier way to say you can't head the ball. It would have been alongside the other rules that US soccer introduced at that time, trying to promote playing through the thirds and playing properly and tiki-taka football kind of thing that they embrace over here in the US. Certainly at the higher echelons anyway. At the youth level, it's still very much kick and rush and try and score as many goals as you can, take advantage of the rules.
So it sounds like your response to these rule changes has been mixed. Do you think there's a positivity there about the fact that they're dealing with these head injuries or the issues surrounding head injuries, but there's also a little bit of negativity about the broader thinking behind it?
Listen, I think as a coach and anybody who is kind of involved in youth soccer, if the evidence is there, which I believe it is, that head injuries are bad. We want to try and eliminate head injuries, particularly in the growing brain. And obviously these younger kids are more vulnerable to these head injuries. It would make sense to try and restrict any possible head injuries. But the way that they're doing it, I'm not 100% certain it's the right way to go. I'm not sure that it's going to eliminate head injuries in the long run. I was speaking to a parent the other day whose son was actually in hospital, was in Rutgers University Hospital in New Jersey with a serious brain injury, had to have an operation, colliding with the goalkeeper at a U15, U16 game in Pennsylvania. And those kind of injuries may come about because players don't know how to head the ball properly because they haven't learned to do it at a younger age. So it swings and roundabouts. We want to eliminate it. What is the best way to do it?
In terms of the I guess, more aesthetic side of the game, as a former player who spent much of his career playing in a period when heading was a staple in the game, what are your feelings about the restriction of heading in football? Do you think football without heading diminishes the game?
It would change the game completely. It would change the dynamic of the game. You know, so Van Dijk score his goal today against United from a corner whipped in. But can you imagine the game without that? I can't. But the days of Route 1 football, the aerial challenges and things that were more commonplace, I think if you look back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, I think the game is played a lot more on the ground these days. It's a lot higher tempo, it's a lot faster. But the risk for collision, the risk for head injuries is still absolutely there. But like any sport, you've got risks and you've got rewards. And I think the risks in football certainly outweigh the damages. My son actually made his European Heineken Cup debut last night for Sale. Got knocked out by the Glasgow hooker. Rugby is a far more brutal game than football, as is American football over here and rugby league at home. And then there's arguments about cricket as well. There's all of these risks. I don't think football has any more risk than any of these games, and the positives certainly outweigh the negative.
In terms of your life as an ex-pro, do you ever have any worries yourself about the ramifications that heading might have had on your own health?
Yeah, I do. My granddad had dementia. My grandmother had dementia. My granddad was a former player. And, you know, back in the day when it was a big, heavy leather ball with laces in it and stuff like that, you know, that's another angle. Is changing the weight of the ball a better option for these kids? Again, but yes, I do worry. Luckily, I didn't play centre-back that much. You know, I didn't head the ball as much as others. You know, if you're playing in League One, League Two and played as centre-back for 15 years, then you've headed the ball an awful lot. And as we've seen with other players, Jeff Astle and the like, you know, it's been proven that it's very, very damaging to you.
You've already given some suggestions, but do you have any other pieces of advice that you would have for people working in the Scottish FA who are seeking to roll out these restrictions? Is there any lessons that they can learn from the USSF?
Yeah, I think it's that the game will change, and unless they want to change the whole game and the way it's played, but I don't think that's what they're trying to do. I think they're trying to protect the children. So think outside the box a little bit and think of the consequences that we've seen on this side of the pond, like I described about coaches launching the ball into the box and things like that, loads of long throws into the penalty areas, which is not something that we want to encourage. We've kind of gone away from that, certainly over the last decade. So, like I said, there may be other rules, banning the goalkeepers from kicking the ball, for example. That was another rule that US soccer introduced, the no punt rule at certain age groups. That forces the players to play out from the back and play through the thirds was the real reason. But that has an impact on heading the ball. The one about the practicing heading. You know, there's so many players, particularly over here, who are frightened to head the ball. So as they get older, they're jumping into aerial challenges with their eyes closed. They're just throwing their head into any kind of situation and not knowing where they're going. At least if you're confident and you know how to head the ball and you have been trained properly, know which part of the head to use, and you jump in with your arms to protect yourself and you can see, you've got your eyes open, then at least you can pull your head out of danger. You know if it's a 50-50, you know if it's a 60-40 in your favour, you know if it's a 30-70 in their favour and you might pull out. These are the kind of things that players can do if they know what they're doing. But if they don't, they're going to lead to, like I described with that poor boy down in Pennsylvania who spent 2 weeks in hospital after a brain operation. That can happen.
So, restrictions on heading the ball in youth football, a net positive or a net negative?
In the long run, if it helps player safety, it has to be a positive. But for me, that's an if. Only time will tell whether the rule changes are preventing the type of injuries that they're talking about. I can't see them increasing the risk, but the risk over the longer term may be very negligent.
Chris McLaughlin is a sports correspondent at BBC Scotland. John Curtis is a former player, a USSF A-licensed coach, and the founder of the National Centre of Excellence programme. This episode was written, recorded and produced by John Mackenzie and directed by Josh Schneider-Weiler. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes or recommend it to a friend? See you next time.